Hollywood has always sold the world a dream, a world of perfect smiles, untouchable stars, and stories with happy endings. But Paul Newman, one of the most respected figures in the industry, knew that behind the cameras lay a far more disturbing reality. He witnessed mothers who terrorized their own children, megastars who preyed on underage girls, and on-set giants whose violence left colleagues physically broken. These were not scenes from scripts. They were real crimes the industry buried for decades, protected by money, power, and silence. The names Newman spoke about were not obscure villains. They were some of Hollywood's most beloved icons. Here is the list Paul Newman tried to warn the world about. Behind Joan Crawford's breathtaking glamour was a mother whose cruelty left everyone who knew the truth deeply unsettled. In a 1979 interview with the New York Times, Newman leaned back quietly and reflected, "Never believe an Oscar can hide the darkness in a family." Joan Crawford is the clearest proof. Hollywood adored her. In 1946, she accepted her Academy Award for Mildred Pierce dressed in a radiant white gown as the entire industry celebrated her triumphant comeback. But hours later, behind the walls of her Brentwood mansion, the celebration had already turned to terror. A maid later testified that Crawford dragged her 11-year-old daughter Christina from her bed, forced her to sing the national anthem, and struck her so hard the sound echoed through the house. Christina would go on to describe her childhood as a gilded hell. Wire hangers became instruments of punishment. Ashtrays were used as weapons. Long sleeves worn in July concealed bruises that no one was permitted to question. Even emotional torment became ritual. An hourglass placed in her room forced her to kneel before a crucifix, and any minor mistake doubled the punishment. What made it even more disturbing was the contrast. While Hollywood magazine covers praised Crawford as a perfect, devoted mother, witnesses recalled Christina bearing fresh bruises just minutes before being made to smile for cameras. Crawford's cruelty extended beyond her own death. When her will was read in 1977, the room went silent at the line excluding Christina and Christopher entirely, for reasons which they well know. As one lawyer present quietly noted, it was the only time he had ever seen a mother take her revenge from beyond the grave. If Joan Crawford inspired fear through control and violence, Bing Crosby inspired it for an entirely different reason. To the world, Crosby was a warm, comforting voice behind White Christmas, the man Life magazine praised as the perfect father and NBC celebrated as America's model dad. But Newman saw something far darker beneath that image. In a 1982 Esquire interview, he said quietly, "They call him the King of Christmas. To me, he was a jailer dressed as an angel." Behind the walls of Crosby's home, his children lived in constant fear. His eldest son Gary later wrote about lying awake at night, clutching a pillow to his chest, waiting for the sound of his father's belt. Appearing on Larry King Live, Gary broke down as he described a man who never offered a hug, only cold stares followed by violence. The trauma rippled through the entire family. Lindsay Crosby spent years in psychiatric care, unable to hear Christmas music without trembling. Dennis Crosby, before taking his own life in 1989, left a heartbreaking note that read, "Every Christmas, the nightmare comes back. I'm too tired." Lindsay followed the same path a year later. A former touring musician told the Los Angeles Times that he once heard shouting, a crack, a child sobs, and then silence, and knew that speaking up would have ended his career instantly. Newman rejected every attempt to excuse this behavior. At a 1985 panel, he said plainly, "Don't blame his childhood. He beat his kids because he enjoyed the power." The entire industry stayed silent because studios depended on Crosby's wholesome image far too much to let the truth surface. When The Adventures of Robin Hood premiered in the late 1930s, Errol Flynn became an overnight sensation. Photoplay crowned him the man every woman longed for and every man wanted to be. But behind that golden image, Hollywood buzzed with persistent and troubling rumors. Everything came to a head in 1942 when Flynn was charged with assaulting 2 underage girls. The Los Angeles Examiner plastered the case across its front pages, and prosecutors described wild parties where guests were far too young to be in attendance. Flynn was ultimately acquitted, but as he walked out of the courthouse he lit a cigarette, smiked, and declared that the ladies would still love Robin Hood. Newman later said he had never witnessed arrogance so completely exposed. Insiders understood that powerful studios and carefully managed journalists had helped protect Flynn throughout the trial. The rumors surrounding him only grew with time, and when he died in 1959 at just 50 years old, his body so deteriorated the coroner said it resembled that of a far older man. Hollywood chose to preserve the heroic legend and bury the darkness beneath it. Mickey Rooney's name still carried the shine of an all-American sweetheart, but Elizabeth Taylor remembered something very different. In 1974, during a private conversation, she broke down recalling her early years at MGM. Newman later told Vanity Fair that she whispered, "You don't understand. Mickey Rooney frightened me more than anyone." During the 1930s and 1940s, Rooney was MGM's biggest moneymaker. The Andy Hardy films made him a national symbol of innocence. But behind the scenes, crew members described explosive outbursts and a temper that could turn violent within seconds. What haunted Taylor most was what began when she was just 14. After National Velvet made her a sensation, Rooney, nearly 25 and already a major star, began pursuing her aggressively. A classmate recalled Taylor wearing thick sweaters in summer to avoid his attention and whispering that she simply wanted to escape. Her diaries from that period spoke of sleepless nights and a feeling of being trapped inside MGM's golden cage. The studio protected Rooney at every turn, forcing gossip columnist Hedda Hopper to retract a story within a single day. Taylor carried that trauma into adulthood, falling silent whenever his name was mentioned. When Newman was asked about Rooney at a 1982 press conference, he answered quietly, "Hollywood has smiles that hide darkness." Mickey Rooney was the clearest proof. Bette Davis was celebrated for her fierce talent and electrifying screen presence, but those who worked alongside her often encountered something very different. Her temper was legendary. A Warner Brothers makeup artist recalled how she could charm reporters one moment and then explode at a supporting actor the next for standing an inch out of his mark. People froze when she raised her voice. Some left the set in tears. The tension reached its most extreme point during the filming of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane in 1962. Where her feud with Joan Crawford turned the production into what Variety described as an open battlefield. In one scene, Davis shoved Crawford so hard she was sent to the hospital. When asked about it afterward, Davis responded simply, "If she got hurt, that's her problem." Crawford later retaliated by hiding metal weights under her costume, causing Davis to strain her back during a dragging scene. Davis treated other colleagues the same way. She reportedly slapped Errol Flynn hard enough to leave a mark that lasted for several minutes, and another actor claimed he quit the industry entirely after she struck him with a script for forgetting a line. Even the sound of her heels approaching in a hallway was enough to make the entire crew brace for what was coming. Newman, who once witnessed her publicly humiliating a young actress on set, later said, "No one denies Bette's talent. But I've never seen a woman spread so much fear on a set." Kirk Douglas was celebrated as the embodiment of Hollywood masculinity, the fearless hero of Spartacus. But away from the screen, he carried a reputation that quietly haunted the industry for decades. Whispers about his predatory behavior toward very young women began circulating in the 1950s and was systematically buried by studios that considered him far too profitable to expose. The most disturbing allegation involved a young Natalie Wood. In 1954, at just 15 years old, she was brought by her mother to the Chateau Marmorne for what was described as a professional mentoring meeting with Douglas. According to her sister Lana's memoir, the teenager returned hours later shaken and in tears, and wrote in her diary, "I must stay silent if I want to keep acting, but I feel filthy." Hollywood kept the story hidden for decades, even after Wood's mysterious drowning in 1980. Former studio workers recalled Douglas routinely inviting very young girls into his dressing room and creating professional consequences for those who refused. Despite everything that circulated behind closed doors, Douglas continued to receive public honors, including the Medal of Freedom in 1996 and an honorary Oscar in 2004. Newman later said in a 60 Minutes interview, "Spartacus may have been a hero, but Kirk Douglas was never a hero, not to the young girls he hunted." In the 1930s, Wallace Beery was one of MGM's most beloved stars. Audiences were charmed by his gruff but tender performances, particularly in The Champ, which earned him an Oscar. Variety described him as having a heart of gold beneath a shell of steel. But behind that image, an entirely different story circulated throughout Hollywood. Beery's name became closely connected to the mysterious 1937 death of Ted Healy, founder of the Three Stooges. Witnesses claimed a large man resembling Beery was seen fighting with Healy outside the Trocadero nightclub on the same night Healy was later found beaten to death in his hotel room. Just 3 days after the incident, MGM abruptly sent Beery to Europe, a move many found deeply suspicious. Although police ruled the death alcohol-related, journalists of the era suggested powerful studio interests had helped ensure the case stayed buried. Stories about Beery's explosive temper extended well beyond that one night. Former child actors alleged he had struck and roughly handled young performers on set. Mickey Rooney once claimed Beery hit him hard enough to knock him off his feet. Gloria Swanson, who had been briefly married to him, wrote in her memoir that his violence during their marriage pushed her to file for divorce as quickly as possible. When Newman addressed the subject in a 1981 interview, he stated that Hollywood had long been aware of these rumors but consistently chose to protect a profitable legend rather than confront an uncomfortable truth. On screen, Beery played lovable rogues and tender fathers. Off screen, according to those who knew him and those who feared him, he left behind a trail of accusations, unanswered questions, and one of the most unsettling mysteries of the Golden Age. These stories are not simply about flawed individuals. They are about a system, one that prioritized fame, box office returns, and public image above the safety and dignity of real people. Paul Newman didn't just name names. He pointed at the machinery behind them, the studios that covered up crimes, the journalists who looked away, and the colleagues who stayed silent because speaking up would have cost them everything. Hollywood's golden glow was always real, but so were the shadows it cast. The question that remains, decades later, is whether the world is finally willing to look clearly at both.